Well, welcome everybody to NC Family's Weekly Update. Jerry, we made it through the crossover deadline at the legislature. Now, this is kind of an arbitrary deadline that's set by the leadership of the General Assembly, where bills that don't contain appropriations, spend money, or don't contain finance provisions, taxing or taking in money, those bills that don't contain appropriations or finances have to pass their chamber of origin, where they were originally introduced. They have to pass that chamber to remain eligible for the remainder of the session. And so we saw hundreds of bills going through dozens of committees this past week. And it was pretty crazy, and I would say it's probably not the craziest crossover deadline week that I've seen at the legislature, but there was a lot going on.
Yeah, and maybe more so the intensity of some of the issues was what was different.
Yeah, that's a great point. It was quite intense, and if you all were keeping up with our emails and updates, you will certainly have seen that. We're going to jump right in because we got a good bit of ground to cover. The biggest issue and the most important and significant issue that the legislature dealt with this week was Senate Bill 20, a bill that originally dealt with the North Carolina Safe Surrender of Infants Law, but was modified to become the Care for Women, Children, and Families Act. This bill essentially, in kind of big picture perspective, would reduce the period for abortion, legal abortions in North Carolina, from 20 weeks down to 12 weeks. That was the big major factor of this bill, but it's a 46-page bill that was chock full of lots of other provisions.
Exactly. And that was the important part of this. I mean, we've all been focused on the time frame when abortions are allowed in North Carolina. And we all want, obviously, to protect unborn children starting at conception. But we found that they were trying to find, before it was brought forward, common ground where they could have the votes to override the veto of the governor, which we knew would happen with any pro-life legislation. And 12 weeks was where the bill ended, but they added a lot of other provisions, important provisions, which will restrict when abortions and how they can happen.
Yeah. And Jerry, we sent out an email earlier in the week, so if you saw that, then you're already informed about this, but we do want to take just a little bit of time to discuss and provide some details about the bill because we think they're really important. As Jerry said, we had been advocating for a stronger bill. Ideally, we would like North Carolina to recognize the sanctity of human life from conception to the point of natural death. However, we sort of ended up with a pro-life coalition that we had been working with for months for a long time, since last year, on a heartbeat bill that would prohibit abortions in North Carolina after a fetal heartbeat is detected. But that bill just was not going to garner the support necessary to override an expected veto of Governor Roy Cooper. And so we ended up at the 12-week provision. I testified in a joint committee of the House and Senate Rules Committees on Wednesday when the bill was first revealed to the public. And basically said this was not the bill that we had hoped for. It wasn't the bill that we had prayed for, but we encourage members of the General Assembly to support it because it's a vast improvement over our current law, which is 20 weeks. So to go to 12 weeks was a great improvement. And the bill also included a number of provisions that would help to save unborn lives in North Carolina, but also to provide support for women and families who are facing crisis pregnancies, unplanned pregnancies, to provide support to give them every reason to choose life as opposed to choosing abortion. So Jerry, let's talk a little bit about some of those provisions.
And that was one of the important things is we've worked really for almost a year on this proposed legislation. Even before Roe versus Wade was overturned, we were anticipating that and knew that in order to make the proper change in the law, we obviously a lot of the focus is on protecting unborn children, but also how do we, and I guess as Christians we would say, how do we love properly the mothers and the families? Because they're going to be in a situation, they're going to need a lot of assistance, and not just from government. And it was pointed out yesterday in prayer time that the church is an important part, and it will be with this legislation. It would have been even more so with a stronger law, but the importance of caring for women and families as well as the unborn child. And that's what some of these provisions
Yeah.
address.
So I'm just going to kind of go down a list. Jerry, jump in as you feel led. But basically, again, the primary provision of the bill is to move the gestational age from 20 weeks to 12 weeks. And we believe, based on statistics in North Carolina, that that's going to save thousands of unborn lives every year. The bill would allow abortion to take place up to 20 weeks for cases of rape and incest, and also allow abortions up to 24 weeks in North Carolina for cases of what the bill defines as a life-limiting anomaly. So if there are diagnoses of certain things, not including Down syndrome, but of other what the bill says cause life-limiting anomalies, abortions could take place up to 24 weeks. Honestly, we're not excited about that provision of the bill. It extends abortions in North Carolina beyond our current time frame for that. But this was one of those things that I think the legislative leadership felt that they had to include into the bill to be able to garner the support to override an expected veto of the governor.
Yeah, and it is with any legislation, what's important is how things are defined. And I know there is a concern with this particular provision that it could be broadly interpreted, which obviously, if this bill is really about, in a large part, protecting unborn children, we don't want it to be a wide spectrum of medical conditions that would fit under this definition. But it was worked on, from what we understand, with medical experts. I know there was a neonatologist who helped with the language with this, somebody who's a long-time expert. All this work, it brought it together a lot of people. And what we found, as even in the debate yesterday, and of course sometimes accusations made, people don't know the effect, but the people who were arguing against the bill pointed to a lot of these provisions saying, this is going to limit abortion even much more than just a 12-week bill, which is a good thing because these are important protections that need to be in place that this bill did address in an important way.
So let me mention some of the other provisions of the bill. It included language to ban partial birth abortions in North Carolina. It would require abortion clinics not only to continue to be inspected annually, but to meet the requirements of ambulatory surgical centers. So that is likely to have a significant impact on a number of the abortion clinics that exist in the state.
Quick side note on that, John. The head of Planned Parenthood in their testimony said, if I understood them right, they're going, we don't have any clinics that meet this definition. So,
well, they're doing surgeries and they ought to. So we'll see what effect that has, assuming this bill, of course, is enacted into law. The bill establishes more detailed informed consent provisions, kind of parallel tracks for women who are seeking or getting information about surgical abortions and also chemical abortions. So making sure that women have information that they need to make informed decisions about abortions and alternatives to abortions. The bill would also enact the Born Alive Abortion Survivor Protection Act, which is legislation that the General Assembly has enacted in the past, but that was vetoed by Governor Cooper, and the legislature didn't have the votes to override the veto. And this basically says if an unborn child is born alive, that the attending physician or any other healthcare provider who is present at that time has to provide life-giving care to that child as they would to any other child in that same gestational age, and then transport the child to a hospital for care. In addition, it would make amendments to the state's current safe surrender law. It provides $160 million in appropriations for child care, for foster care improvements, for adoption assistance and things of that nature. So there's a lot in this bill, again, not only to protect unborn life, but also to support women and families who are facing unplanned and crisis pregnancies.
Okay.
Yep. So we're really appreciative of the legislature for moving forward on this bill. Now, Governor Cooper has already said that he's going to veto the bill. That means it comes back to the General Assembly for veto overrides. Based on the votes that took place in the House and the Senate over the last couple days, the votes exist, but just barely to override. Now, it requires a supermajority vote which is, according to the Constitution, 3/5 of members present and voting in both chambers to override. So it requires, if all members are present, 30 members of the Senate out of the 50-member Senate and 72 members in the House out of the 120 members in the House. The Republican caucuses is 30 members in the Senate and 72 members in the House after Representative Tricia Cotham, who was a Democrat from Charlotte, changed her party affiliation to Republican. And so they've got the votes, but just barely the votes, if all members of the Republican caucus in both chambers vote to override the governor. This does not preclude Democrats, a handful of Democrats, 1, 2, 3, maybe even more, from crossing over and voting for the bill as well. But based on the vote that we saw on House Bill 20 in the House and the Senate, that is probably unlikely, but hopeful.
Because it has happened in the past where Democrats have voted for pro-life legislation, but as John said, that did not happen with this particular legislation. Could still happen with a veto override vote.
Yeah. So we're expecting the governor to veto the bill, probably pretty soon, and then the bill would come back to the legislature. Keep your eyes open because we will be sending out alerts about that time frame to keep you up to date on that. So really, really key bill, very important bill. But Jerry, let's move on real quickly. Another major bill that the legislature took up and the House passed was House Bill 808, which would ban or prohibit surgery on minors in North Carolina for gender transition. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the original bill included provisions prohibiting surgery as well as administration of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. The bill that they brought up for consideration did just address the surgery aspect. It dealt with the very rare exceptions where there could be a need for surgery. Also has a provision at the end of the bill talking about state funding not going for any of these types of procedures or chemical administration. So that bill is one that, as John said, has passed. The House will now go to the Senate. The Senate version of this bill was all-inclusive. So it's going to be interesting to see what the Senate does since it's a different bill that's coming over to them. They may add those provisions back in that prohibit the puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones.
Yeah, and Sharon Sullivan, our government relations associate, testified on the bill in the House Rules Committee. So we're grateful for that. Unfortunately, she couldn't be with us today. But we're very hopeful, as Jerry said, and we'll be advocating with members both in the Senate and in the House to restore the provisions in the bill, not only that would prohibit surgeries on minors, but also puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, since those treatments, so-called treatments, do have a significant effect on the human body, can lead to sterility and irreversible body changes.
Right.
And so in addition to body mutilation that takes place from surgeries. So we're going to continue to be working on this. I will note that when the bill was voted on the House floor, all Republicans supported it, and there were 2 Democrats, Garland Pierce and Michael Ray, who supported the bill, and we really appreciate their support on that legislation. So again, this bill has got to see action in the Senate to ultimately be enacted into law, and we're going to continue to work on that. So, Jerry, it was a really busy week and a lot of tension, as you mentioned before, but in the midst of that, yesterday, Thursday, May the 4th, was the National Day of Prayer, and there was a gathering out across the street from the legislature for recognition of the National Day of Prayer, and for a lot of our lawmakers and other elected leaders in the state to pray. And that took place, and that was a really nice event that was much more kind of bringing folks together despite the controversies that were taking place across the street at the legislature.
Right. And it really was good because it was kind of in the midst of the debate on the pro-life legislation that Senator Berger, they were all aware that the National Day of Prayer event was scheduled for noon yesterday. And so they took a recess in the midst of the debate, came over, and this is what, as John said, was very encouraging from the legislature. there were Republicans and Democrats, and what they did is they allowed all the members to come up, introduce themselves, and to lead in prayer. And so it was wonderful to hear. I mean, everybody acknowledging. I mean, it was a time to give praise and thanks to God, and I think not maybe without exception, there wasn't an exception, acknowledging our dependence on God for His wisdom, for Him to work in all the situations and all the decisions that are being made. So as you say, it was a very encouraging time, literally in the midst of a very intense time of debate in the legislature.
Yeah. And Jerry, you led prayer as well. And we're really grateful for that, for your representation, not only of the Family Policy Council in that context, but just as a brother in Christ and a believer, and someone who is down at the legislature every day in relationship with these lawmakers to have an opportunity to speak and to implore them to really seek wisdom from the Lord, and employ that wisdom in the decisions that they're making. So thank you for your leadership in that. So that again was a really special time in the midst of a very busy and often contentious week. Finally, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention something that took place last Friday after we recorded our weekly update last Friday, and that was that the North Carolina Supreme Court came out with a number of rulings, 3 in fact, dealing with elections. They basically restored voter identification or the requirement for voter ID in North Carolina. They also acknowledged that it's the General Assembly, not the judicial branch, that has the authority to draw and enact redistricting maps or maps for both the North Carolina legislature and also Congress. And they also basically reversed a decision of the prior court, which was Democrat majority. This court is a Republican majority, but reversed the prior court on an issue dealing with when felons, people convicted of felonies, have a restored right to vote. So those were significant. We're definitely going to be seeing more from the effect of these rulings later in the legislative session, is what we're hearing, that the General Assembly is going to redraw congressional and possibly state legislative maps once again. So we will see that take place either later this session or possibly in a special session later in the summer or the early fall.
And it was as an example of the different roles with the new court. In all these cases, they did, we all can say, well, we don't want activist judges with a different view from ours. We should not, I've learned over time, none of us should want any activist judges. We need to do what they did from all that we read in these cases. They took the language of the law, statutory law, constitutional law, and applied it to these specific situations. And so, some people were upset and we're going, no, if you read these opinions, you'll see this is what the court did. And they were pointing to the error of what was done in the past, which we can all be tempted to do, is try to arrive at a conclusion that we want instead of looking at what does the language of the law say.
Yeah. Very good. Well, friends, thanks as always for your time and attention. Next week at the General Assembly should be a bit more tame than this week. In fact, we're hearing that they're going to kind of take a little bit of a break. But please keep your eyes and ears open on your email for any updates or action alerts. There's still activity going on. Please continue to pray. That's the most important thing, is to pray for our lawmakers, that they will, in fact, as we heard on Thursday from a lot of lawmakers, that they will rely on wisdom from the Lord in making the decisions that they do. And we will be back again next Friday with an update, but keep your eyes open for your email inbox as well, because we're going to be providing updates on kind of after the dust has cleared from this crossover deadline week, kind of the status of bills, what's still active, what's not. That sort of thing. Also, as always, we have links to articles and other resources below the video, so take advantage of that. And if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to NC Family. You can do so on our website at ncfamily.org, or you can send an email to mail@ncfamily.org. Again, that's mail@ncfamily.org if you have any questions or ideas. Thanks again for your time and attention, for your prayers, for your support, and we will see you next week. God bless.